Welcome back, everyone. So for this next session, we're going to hope to get to the bottom of some important questions using a panel of experts. So I'll briefly introduce, if my memory serves me well. Molly Henry is coming here from Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics, as well as the New Toronto Metropolitan University. Petri Toiviainen from the University of Jyväskylä. Martin Clayton from Durham University. Peter Keller from the University of Aarhus. And Carolyn Palmer is zooming in at 7 a.m. in the morning in Quebec. Eirik, I can hear the Thursday delay. So Carolyn, if you turn off the YouTube, mute YouTube, or exit YouTube, and you can just join through Zoom. I'll let Eirik communicate with her in the chat. But yes, thank you so much, Carolyn, for also being here with us. So the title of this panel discussion is Entrainment, Alignment, Synchrony, Coordination. What are we talking about and where are we going? And the reason I was wanting to have this discussion is because I want us to reflect a bit more critically on what is really the essence of everything we've been talking about the last day and a half, and what do we need to do to progress in the field. And these experts are from various different domains that we've explored in musicology, social behavior psychology, neuroscience, computational modeling. And so I'm hoping that they can introduce what domain or camp or field they feel that they most fit into, and then also what is the most important aspects of entrainment coming from your perspective. So I'll pass to Molly first, even though Molly gave us a brief introduction on that yesterday. If you wanted to, again, re-summarize for people that are just joining us.
Sure. Yeah, I hope, well, no guarantee that everybody was here yesterday, so I tried to preempt my definition of entrainment and the things I think are important about it, but I can give you a bit of my background. So I'm an experimental psychologist by training, turned neuroscientist a little bit later. So I started in a lab working on the psychophysics of time perception and rhythm perception, and when I joined that lab, I guess a bit of background is in time perception and rhythm perception, as probably everybody here knows, there's historically been sort of two camps of theory. So there's an entrainment perspective and there's more of a sort of timekeeper information processing perspective. I won't go into what those mean. And the supervisor of the lab that I joined was pretty agnostic in terms of how he allowed each student to form their own theoretical perspective and derive hypotheses about the things that we wanted to test. So one of the first weeks that I arrived, he gave me the book Sync by Steve Strogatz and said, have a look at this and see what you think. And I was staying up late at night and reading it in bed. I couldn't put it down. And he was like, oh, you're a dynamical systems person. Okay, you're going to go into this camp. That was his barometer to figure out how he was going to sort of guide us, each student. So that's how I originally found out how I aligned. And I aligned mostly with a sort of Pekovskian, Strogatzian kind of understanding of entrainment that comes from physics. I think that works well with the kinds of things that I'm interested in. I mean, maybe I'm preempting, we were talking before we even got up here about how, the level of analysis at which you're working determines the aspects of entrainment that are going to be important. So for me, it's okay to sort of stick at this low level. I don't think that that's necessarily the right level to stay at when we're talking about group synchrony, emotions, social context, stuff like that. But that's not my area, so I will not talk about that further unless somebody that actually knows things about it speak to that.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm mostly interested in music and movement, music information retrieval, and music neuroscience, particularly in more or less naturalistic settings. When it comes to entrainment, my focus is mostly on the listener and the movement on the listener, like how the listeners embody music when they hear it, how they interact with the gestures, with other dancers, and well, we try to use a naturalistic paradigm as much as possible. I would call it semi-naturalistic, so we have naturalistic stimulation, naturalistic task, which is just move to the music, but we are still in the lab to collect accurate mocap data. So what can I say? Yeah, it's complicated to understand the complex whole body movement that is spontaneous. There's lots of inter-individual variability. It's well, it's multidimensional. It's happens in several time scales, and it's non-stationary, and so on. So there's lots of challenges in that sector.
Thank you. Well, I won't repeat the last hour that you just listened to. But yeah, so as I said, my background's in ethnomusicology. I guess if you look at my publications, you'd say there's a mixture of ethnographic work, kind of theory and analysis, and empirical analysis, or kind of empirical musicology. So there's kind of a disciplinary spread there. I've explained, why I think like entrainment might be an interesting fit for ethnomusicology. I have to say I have exactly the same experience as you, Molly, in reading Sync and being blown away by that. I mean, I was kind of introduced to these ideas, I think, initially by Udo Will, my colleague, who I think must be unique in having PhDs in both ethnomusicology and neurobiology. Can't be many of those around in the world. But kind of having been introduced to the idea by Udo, really being blown away by Strogas and thinking that this just makes perfect intuitive sense. I'm sure lots of this stuff happens in music too. Now, I mean, looking at the stuff I showed, in as far as an ethnomusicologist can be committed to a particular view of time processing, which is not my academic expertise at all, I'm very attached to this entrainment model. I'm sure if you were being picky, you could look at some of the examples I showed and say, well, is this what exactly is the oscillator here? And is that actually a direct entrainment of two oscillators, or is that the kind of second order alignment, which is based on blah, blah, blah. So happy to talk about that stuff, but I'm very happy with that, the model you described so well the other day.
Thanks. Yeah, I started as a performer and then did a degree in musicology, and after that psychology, and then eventually ended up working in cognitive neuroscience. And during that period, at the transition between psychology and cognitive neuroscience, I was working as a postdoc with Bruno Repp, and many of you know him from finger tapping studies and modeling in the information processing, the linear timekeeper type model. So I was very much exposed to that and working in that, but at the same time being in New Haven and closely linked to University of Connecticut, which was a real hotbed and still is for dynamical systems. I did do a nonlinear dynamics course there with the graduate students as a postdoc there. So I was actually quite interested in both of them. I think I ended up working on developing models in the information processing tradition for two main reasons, or three reasons actually. One is because the dynamical systems approach was attracting so much attention, having so many people working on it. I thought it's still worth, seeing how far we can carry things with the information processing for two reasons. One is it's easy to understand. They're deterministic and linear. You can work at it in your head if you do it long enough, even fairly complex models. But secondly, because I think from the psychology perspective, in terms of understanding what performers are consciously thinking about and what strategies they're employing, that probably is modeled quite neatly within that framework, because the dynamical systems framework, traditionally at least, and now it's changing, focused on the emergent spontaneous phenomena that performers don't really think about when they're performing. So if one wants to educate performers, and as I mentioned, I had the music performance background, I think it's useful to be able to describe things at that level as well. That said, I think that both approaches should work together and are necessary to explain the system as a whole. And in terms of the sorts of terms that we're discussing, the terminology that we're discussing today, From the psychology perspective, we're interested in the coordination of behavior when we're talking about ensembles and social interaction. When we're talking from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, we're thinking really about coherence of brain activity as a general term. But if we want to tie it together and think of what we're talking about in terms of real human behavior in social settings, communication, I think that's where kind of alignment comes into it, alignment of thoughts and feelings. So that's my 2 cents. Oh, Krona or whatever. Yeah. And
Sorry. Amazing, yeah. Now you hold it, you hold on to it, and now we offer Carolyn the microphone. But yeah. So Carolyn, you have to unmute yourself on your end. Perfect.
Let's try it this way. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Fantastic. My background also was in music performance. I was in a conservatory, and I got really interested in what went on individually in practice rooms for so many hours a day didn't translate that easily into group performance. And so for me, there were emergences. And I also got my degree in statistics. Don't ask me why. I was drawn to it, perhaps because it wasn't as messy as emergences. And I grew to really appreciate the distinction between stochastic and deterministic modeling. And I got lucky later. I realized I was drawn to cognitive psychology, and I found someone who worked in music cognition, and then my career just took off. But it took a while of trying things out to figure out the right fit. The panelists are talking about perspectives on entrainment, and mine certainly comes from the production side, more about performance than perception, although of course you can't really separate those. And the analytical side. Can we make models precise enough that they can be fairly easily disconferred? So figuring out how to define those models was a big part of my training.
Thank you so much. And yeah, these are perfect introductions. And then you already touched on it, Peter, but so if you don't want to comment, you could pass the mic. But the next question I had thought of was, how do you view, with focusing on the terminology and definitions, do you see terms like synchrony, coordination, alignment, entrainment as distinct or often explaining the same things or conflated with each other, and how does that relate and differ by field is kind of the angle I'm going with this question. So you touched on it. I don't know if you want to comment further on what you think.
I've seen it all. The short answer. Really, the way terms are used, and there's been a lot of effort in trying to form agreement on this, and it is a temporary agreement that then, like a truce a little bit, that then breaks apart at some point. And I find that personally interesting, like why it is a challenge to define this and why people do adopt different ideas. I mean, we do have dictionaries and we do have a literature where one could get some consensus. Maybe AI is going to save us if we do that. But in fact, I think that the points of understanding why there are different perspectives is going to be interesting. But to be more practical, I think one thing that's important, or two things that are important, one is always qualifying how the term is used, either with an adjective, like in sensory motor synchronization. Having sensory motor there is important and tells you something, and there are maybe other and better examples. And so qualifying it is important. And the second thing, and this comes, I guess, from psychology, having operational definitions, like using the term, but also saying, what you're measuring, what you're assuming are conditions for this process to be going on, actually defining it operationally as well. So I think those two things, if assuming, as I do, maybe I don't want to be too pessimistic, that one will not find consensus that's going to have longevity. The workaround is to be clear and specific with adjectives and qualification, what one actually means, and consistency within a particular project or line of work, and also operational definitions, which often are assumed that we know, but I think that's where things sometimes fall apart, that not everyone carries the same assumptions.
Yeah, I feel like it's often disciplinary focuses. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, very, very quickly. I mean, Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, I'm totally for a strict definition of entrainment, you know, and I've written a few, and I'm totally happy with, you know, Molly's strict definition from the other day. At the same time, you could probably go to my publications and find a dozen examples where I've not used the term in that strict way. And I think there's something about the phenomenon, especially, you know, if you look in a real life phenomenon, well, there's something going on that is allowing people to coordinate. Let's call it entrainment. And maybe in my case, you never get to the point where you say, well, actually, maybe I didn't mean entrainment at the start.
Well, yes, I guess there are narrow definitions, wider definitions of the term entrainment. That it really depends on what is the focus of research. I mean, there's like maybe it's good to add some attribute in the beginning, like say rhythmic entrainment, emotional entrainment, social entrainment. They all focus on different kind of methods and phenomena, and probably how to operationalize them is really different for each of them.
Yeah, I think I can only echo the point about operationally defining what we're talking about. I think as long as we're clear and, you know, another person can read a paper and see, you know, if I say this is the way that I'm defining entrainment, this is the way that I'm defining synchrony, you can read that paper and say, oh, okay, well, I would have called that coordination, but at least I know what your definition is and I can map my own term onto what you're talking about. So I think as long as we're being clear definitionally, even if we're not, I mean, we might change our definitions over time, but as long as in any instance we're being clear about, you know, the specific phenomenon or process that we're talking about, then that I think is the solution. We've all punted a little bit, so maybe I can try to, the one place I would distinguish, I mean, you ask about terms, entrainment, synchrony, coordination, alignment. I think in different fields, we use those terms to different, in different amounts, but I would maybe put a distinction between, I would distinguish between entrainment and synchrony. Synchrony to me is a dependent measure. So as I said yesterday, if you have two systems that have the same period, they will be synchronized with each other. That doesn't mean they've done something. It means they're doing things that happen at the same time. Whereas entrainment for me is really some sort of process. It involves some activity, some kind of adjustment, and that's a necessary part of the definition of entrainment, in my opinion. So just to be a bit more specific.
And you hit on the period aspect, but do you consider phase alignment as well as part of synchrony, or can
No.
synchrony be separate from phase alignment?
Well, synchrony can be, you can have synchrony with different phase alignments. So for example, sea lion pups will call out of phase with each other on purpose to try to signal they want to be heard by their mothers, right? So they adopt a strategy of vocalizing in a silent period when the other ones aren't vocalizing, and I think there's evidence that does involve some entrainment, it does involve some adjustment. It's just that the goal for that system is not to be phase aligned, it's to be anti-phase with each other.
And still label it synchrony.
Yeah. So I would say that synchrony is a consistent phase relationship.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be an in-phase phase relationship, but should be a consistent phase relationship. So it could be, for example, this sort of, it was sort of between anti-phase and a quarter out, but it was really, really, really consistent. I would actually label that synchrony from a sort of dependent measure perspective. But yeah, so I think entrainment really is more of a process and synchrony is more of a
And then
measure.
a follow-up question that this brings to my mind is because I think like when we're communicating our science to the public and disseminating our work to, you know, lay person, to use that term loosely, or like somebody that isn't in our field, then I feel like those terms can often have different colloquial meanings. Oh, yeah. And I wish does anybody want to comment on how do you go about communicating what you really mean by entrainment, synchrony, alignment, coordination to somebody who's not in our field or not in any of the fields present here?
I mean, I think in my experience with public science communication, the most important part is to communicate meaning and importance in a way that's understandable and not to get too in the weeds about what your theoretical perspective is, but the public tends to be more interested in sort of outcomes and why this is important and why this might impact my life or you know, the life of a family member or something like that. And so when I communicate my science publicly, I definitely use words like synchrony in a way that I don't mean when I'm writing a paper, because this is a word that people understand, and I can say our, you know, brain rhythms synchronize with rhythms in the world, and you know, I mean entrainment internally, but I'm not going to try to, you know, give somebody a whole PhD's worth of theory to understand exactly what that distinction is. You know, I think being clear with public communication and using words that are intuitive to people is really important, even if they deviate from our own scientific operational definitions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, do you want to pass the mic to Peter?
Well, just on that, I, of course, totally agree. So I don't think, sometimes a slide might have the word entrainment on it, but usually one would refer to even synchrony is too much. Sync, like in sync is enough, and coordination usually do, because subtle nuances can only kind of muddy the water in that context. Although probably not as much as we think. But I just wanted to make one other comment. You mentioned the seal study. Just to throw a spanner in the work, because you love it when I disrupt things, right? The one funny thing about that, this is work of Andrea Ravignani, you're referring to, I think, but they actually use the term anti-synchrony, although it is a phase, like a 90-degree phase angle that's consistent, but to distinguish it from being in phase, it's not anti-phase as well, but they use anti-sync. So really terminology can be, you can see why we're having this panel here. It can be confusing. Maybe Carolyn has something to say, but just so we don't...
Well, I was taken with Molly's reliance on period for synchrony, because depending on your perspective, you could think about the rhythms of music as people carrying different periods, like someone's tapping at twice the rate of someone else, or performing at twice the rate, right? Special ratios, 2-to-1, 3-to-1. Those, they don't share the same period. So I think this is a good example, because it forces models to say, well, how is it that tapping in certain rhythmic relationships, like 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-2, you know, the more complex ones, what does that force us to say about synchrony? And I think looking at the range of rhythms that we are capable of producing is fruitful for trying to define synchrony.
Beautiful. Anybody else want to comment? No. Sorry, sometimes I'm getting distracted texting for text solution stuff, so apologies for all the times that my dynamic attention hasn't been fully on the beat. But to follow up with another question, I would love to ask, as some of the big names in our field, a lot of us aspiring newer people in the field are often looking for, there's mountains of research we have to go through to understand, where are the gaps? Can you give us quick and dirty solution for how can we as the next generation come in and try to approach such a mountain of research, and where do you see as being the next, I don't know, either hot topic that funding agencies would like to see, or that also is still missing? I know, Martin, you actually mentioned this in the end of your talk, people need to do more work in real music, and that's so important. There's so many different musics to look at, so maybe you want to comment more first.
Yeah, I think I mentioned a few already. You use wider varieties of sounds, derive research questions from real music, look more at multi-level system, because when we talk about musical beats, we're never talking about a single level. Never, almost never talking about a single level of pulsation. We're always talking about hierarchical patterns, about how do you actually how do you model the interaction between the multi-level systems? It's mathematically much more complicated, right? So can we do more work on that? As Carolyn's saying, what are the different patterns that people can lock into together different phase relationships, polyrhythmic. There's so much stuff out there, really, from my point of view.
Yes, entrainment is important for our social communication, and like if we perceive another person to be entrained or not entrained with us, then that might have some consequences. And I think there's not enough work on how we perceive entrainment, like when we see a person moving, like when do we see them entrained or not, and how can we model that? What are the kinematic correlates of perceived entrainment? Maybe another thing is the effect of different modalities like auditory, visual, even tactile on interpersonal entrainment. It has been studied somewhat, but I'm sure there are gaps in that as well. And then making the research more naturalistic, going out from the lab, is still something that has not been done sufficiently. So those are the main gaps I think I have identified.
In terms of how to approach, so if you're new to the field and starting to try to get the lay of the land, I think unfortunately there's not an easy answer. The answer is read like a maniac and read more. Read sync. Read the old stuff, know the history. There's no solution that isn't reading. But in terms of where the gaps are, what the next hot topic is, or what funding agencies are going to like, I'm going to give a very non-answer answer to that, which is study what you like. Find the thing that that resonates with you. We all do this because it's fun, I hope. We got into this because we were excited by it, and we chose our niche research questions because that's what we were excited by. And when you're forced to do something that's not that is a situation where you can become unhappy doing the thing that actually you really loved and is the reason you got into this. So don't worry too much about like what's the next hot thing, what's the the big gap. None of us are going to solve the world formula, unfortunately, on our own. So what's the big gap that we need to fill? I don't know. Do what you like. If there's something, even if it's niche as hell, and you're the only person that thinks it's interesting, if you really, really love it, do that. And your ability, we all depend on external funding. Your ability to frame your question in terms of importance or impact just comes with time. The more you think about it and the more you contextualize it, the more you gain a bigger picture perspective about how to sell it. It's unfortunate that we have to sell it, but that's something that develops. And I think as long as you're excited about your topic, then that will come.
Those are wonderful career advice. Peter first, and then Carolyn.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, and I think especially well considered if we think about the different research centres. So, here with RITMO, Jyväskylä, the centre in Aarhus, Carolyn's group, Martin's group, Molly's group. If you look at what's going on the web pages there, or if you see the proposals for the centre, you see these big themes. These centres are so successful because they have identified gaps and proposed methods for putting it together. That said, there's still a lot of work to be done on that, and we've seen examples of it, of course, in the presentations over the last days. It was mentioned going into naturalistic contexts. I mean, that's especially important because I think, a lot of us are doing research, and I don't know what the balance of humanities and kind of sciences, hard sciences, whatever, is represented here, but we have a broad spectrum of things, so we can tackle things at different issues. The questions of why we have, evolved to have entrainment, and the work on social bonding and other such processes are relevant to that. But still, really, the question Petri just mentioned about perception of synchrony. Now, presumably that may have some quite interesting evolutionary connotations in the sense, if you think about these recent papers on coalition signaling and things like that as a driving force behind evolution of entrainment capacities. So I think finding out ways to address questions of why we do it, as well as understanding what it really is in terms of descriptive, and then how in terms of the mechanisms. And now it's interesting because, of course, starting out, the way things work is it's usually quite an individual effort that then grows into collaborations and then larger teams, and then you have centers of excellence and that sort of thing in terms of an individual researcher's trajectories. So at the start, I think it's worth thinking about questions and going one step beyond one's immediate question. And I'm not necessarily talking about this as a topic that sometimes comes up, like what's the use of the research, what can it contribute to the real world and that sort of thing. I'm not thinking about that in this case, although one often has to entertain such ideas too. But really, what will the next question be, and how that will lead and require collaboration with another discipline across also science, humanities boundaries, of course. One thing I mentioned before, the musicology background, just a quick anecdote that this won't be a long story, by the way, those who have heard long stories before, that the way I found my musicology topic, which was speech melody theory of the Moravian composer Janáček, was reading a footnote in a book chapter by John Tyrrell, by musical. And unfortunately, now in psychology and neuroscience, we're encouraged not to use footnotes. All the journals say don't use footnotes unless you. And that's where all the good ideas used to be, for gaps. The gaps used to be found in the footnotes. So I think we could consider bringing that back, maybe.
Oh, sorry, Carolyn.
These were all excellent points by the panelists who are more awake than I am. But if I had one thing to say, it would be to grad students or potential grad students, learn to program, because the tools that are coming out that are freeware for doing all kinds of analyses on new physiological approaches, new neural approaches, even behavioral approaches, the tools require fairly adept knowledge of the programming language in which they're written in order for you to apply them in interesting ways. And I think that's what makes so many of these centers and the workshops at this entrainment event have such a huge payoff. So I think we all have to get better at our computer chops in order to stay on top of this whole interdisciplinary venture.
Yeah, and actually on this topic, I was planning on if you've presented a workshop or tutorial or demo for technology, send me an email with the link to the GitHub repo, and I'll link to it on the schedule, because I'm hoping to get the mocap toolbox tutorials. I've just found your R repository. It looks beautiful. And yes, Bavo did an amazing job this morning, Carolyn. I was so blown away, and I think everybody else was as well, with his ability to navigate so quickly through the different technologies that he's using, Unity and Pure Data, so it was really inspiring. I remembered when I lost my attention earlier what I was going to comment on, though. Back to the Molly and Carolyn's discussion on synchrony, period, and phase. It made me think, and I'm going to make a statement that I want somebody to argue against, but my impression as a summary, can I be so bold to say that it was like the neuro perspective, synchrony could be phase locking, and then in the behavioral perspective that Carolyn brought in, then synchrony actually included not just period locking, could be other periods, but also phase locking? No, we can't say that. Okay. Peter, can you pass the mic to Molly? Oh, okay, Carolyn.
So I'm sure everyone on the panel will have an opinion.
I was trying
about
to
them.
understand the way synchrony is used based on the different domains, and that there was the neuro perspective that, okay, same period, different phase, okay. And then you said, well, in behavioral situations, we have synchrony as being different periods where there's a phase alignment. So I was hoping to then put this into a succinct sentence, but I hope somebody tells me, no, it's not as simple as that.
I think you have to consider the phase and the period alignment at the same time to really understand what is that trajectory, what's that sequence you're trying to understand, whether it's a performer or a brain listening. It's unfortunate, but the methods you use to analyze will give you one or the other, usually, and you have to figure out how are you going to combine these, because they're both influencing the musician, right? Like those rhythmic ratios. My understanding is that the term entrainment was originally used for brain activity responding to internal and external events. And when you talk about brain-related entrainment, that usually has a certain flavor to it that's driven by the tools that we use and the measures that we have of the brain response. But when you turn it over to behavior, and where everything is observable, presumably, then phase and period both come into play because they can be directly measured. So things are changing in the brain world so that we can get better measures. And I think that's where Molly's talk is really important. But I wouldn't try to distinguish phase and period by behavior and brain.
Yeah. I think I will only add a tiny bit, if anything, to that. I will just agree wholeheartedly that it's really, really, really important to recognize that our tools shape the way that we interpret what we're looking at, for better or worse. So if we are using phase locking, for example, to analyze whether a neural signal is synchronized with some sound rhythm, then we get stuck to this idea that entrainment is phase locking because that's the measure that we have. And it's hard to step outside of what our measures deliver, but it's really, really important to be able to distinguish the measure from the phenomenon, and not to be limited by the measure in terms of how we're understanding the phenomenon. I think it's not, I would say, maybe this is, I don't think this will be controversial, but I would say that any kind of behavioral synchrony we see, I would be really surprised if that would be possible if we weren't doing it with our brain first. So if it didn't happen in there, then I'm not sure we would be able to generate it. I mean, maybe there's something emergent about the way our bodies are also part of the system that we wouldn't predict. But anyway, so no, it's not the case that neuroscience considers entrainment to be phase locking. Synchrony, okay. Sorry, I misremembered.
This is getting to where some people have conflate those terms, and then you also said the mechanism versus outcome.
Yeah, exactly. We conflate the terms, I think, as Carolyn said, largely because we interpret through the lens of our measures. The small thing I wanted to add is that I gave a really, really, really simplistic cartoon sort of version of what a neural signal looks like and what it means for a neural signal to be entrained in a one-to-one period-matched phase-locked way to a stimulus. But of course, we see, and it's really hard to see some of the brain signals that are interesting. So that is an additional challenge to see, for example, integer ratio relationships between brain activity and environmental rhythm, for example. But I think we also have really complex ideas about how neural networks might be formed via some kind of synchrony that allows for communication between different brain areas that are forming a network. So for example, there are all different forms of coupling. There's one-to-one sort of phase coupling. There's phase amplitude coupling, for example, where a higher frequency oscillation that it cannot become phase locked because it's way too fast. The power of that oscillation will fluctuate time locked to a stimulus. So yesterday there was a nice talk about how beta oscillations are fluctuating in terms of power in a way that's time locked to the stimulus. So I think there are these in the brain, there are other complex forms of synchrony that might have important implications for the way that our brains form networks and how neural communication happens. So it's, not so. What did you want somebody to say? No, it's not that simple.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to move on because I'll just do the one last question and then open it up to the audience. And this question is a bit big as well, but I was hoping to ask generally, what do you see or what is the role of social context that you see in the study of entrainment, and how would you incorporate ideas about social context? And I'm going to add another layer of complexity. So social context and rhythm, so that everybody can answer this. So, because these are different aspects that come into play, and then I want you to comment on how you see these incorporated into the study. The different domains as well as like conceptualization of the terms, and then also the measurement, and then, yes. I'll let Carolyn, or no, whoever, oh yeah, we haven't heard from, Carolyn, would you like to comment?
I was really hoping you'd forget about me off in the corner. Okay, so social psychology has really improved, from my perspective within psych, on addressing interactions between people. And music is such an interactive thing, both between performers, between audience members, that it's nice to see that we could take some theoretical principles from social approaches to interpersonal relationships and how those are influenced when you're in different scenarios. I think maybe we can't take it too far because musicians performing tend to work together for a while, so they know each other. But that's not true of audience members. They come together from all different groups. So I've really liked learning about new work in social contexts that seems to carry over to groups. On rhythm, I do think that your perspective can be culturally driven, as I think Martin has pointed out a lot, by the music you are familiar with. And so we forget that these important distinctions hold. It's become harder and harder to study cross-culturally without the Western approach impeding on other communities that for a long time have been distinct from the Western approach. So I would love to hear what the panel thinks of that. Is it still possible to go to a place where, you know, the top 10 in the Western radio stations are not playing all the time? So yes, I think rhythm's got to drive the way you think about synchrony and entrainment. But the social context, I think we're gaining a lot of knowledge now.
Well, I guess, yeah, when it comes to spontaneous movement, moving to music, I think social context is very important. I mean, it has pro-social effects, as mentioned earlier, and also like the complex dynamics of group dancing is a fascinating topic to study. I think that's a good way to learn about the social interactions.
Yeah, absolutely, hugely important. I always wonder about the word context. You know, what's social context? But I think if we talk about social interaction and about musical interactions being social interactions, then I think that opens up a whole area. You know, anytime you're dancing with other people, you're playing music with other people, you're listening to other people playing music, it's at some level it's always a social interaction, whether it's someone you don't know and you're kind of figuring out, is this someone I'm happy sharing this space with and doing something with, or if you're in a musical ensemble and you're playing with your best mate, or you're playing with someone you can't stand, or you're playing in an ensemble but you really love the guy, but it's really annoying because he wants to play faster than you and you can't figure out the right tempo, and all that stuff is always happening. And we've done so much of this with the Indian musicians, and it's so. I mean, Indian musicians are fantastic. I mean, they're wonderful people. They're the best people in the world. The number of times I've been to a fantastic gig of Indian music and everyone's hugging each other at the end, and what a marvelous thing. You can bet the moment they come off the stage, the soloist will say, "Martin, wasn't that double player terrible? He couldn't keep a beat. Oh God, it was a nightmare." And this stuff goes on all the time. So it's a kind of that you get this kind of multi-level thing that you kind of have the relationship with the other musician, but then you're also performing and you want to present your relationship as being something that it might not be in real life. And you know, you can be apparently beautifully in time with the other person, but there's a social tension which is actually being expressed in the timing relationship if you only look for it. And I could go on for a long time, but yeah, I definitely hugely important.
I guess somewhere in another place there's a workshop going on where they're having a panel on what is social, because that's, of course, another big topic, as you mentioned, on the context. And I think here we have kind of probably all in agreement on it, but have different perspectives, or at least in terms of where our research is focused, from kind of individual differences, and by that I mean in the psychology sense, personality, right up to different cultural traditions and so on, as Martin presented before. I think one area that's probably, that I'm interested in, and there's probably less work, there's not so much work at the moment going on, if you think about computational models of behavior, how they can take into account social modulation by social factors. So for example, if you have a model and it has a particular parameter, how does that, is that parameter linked, what social factors is it linked to, what personality variables and other things at that level, not at the level just in terms of at a behavioral level, but really at the mechanism level is one area where I think there's interesting work to come.
Thank you so much. Now I'm going to open it up to the audience. I was just trying to get the YouTube chat, read the WhatsApp group chat, and also listen at the same time, so I'm sorry. My attentional capacities are limited. But is anybody wanting to ask a question to the panel? And not all at once now. Oh. Bravo. So you're going to have to... no, you can...
I can do like this?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the great conversation already. I was thinking, and it's quite a simple question and quite open, this hype about artificial intelligence, and my question is more about the role of technology and how you see technology evolve in your own work. So it's quite open because like I really appreciated, Martin, your presentation of pose detection. So there's a lot of machine learning, and so opening up great technology, opening up certain fields. So this cross-disciplinary use of technologies is great to see. But with this, for example, large language models and what this AI is doing, and I've been talking to people here, and like we all have tasted, I think, of these things, but of course they will evolve, and it will evolve in whatever ways. But I'm curious about your expertise and experience, how you see things evolve, whether you're actively using it in your research, and if not, why not, or any reflections regarding this technology, let's say.
Yeah, I seem to have this object, so... yeah, thanks for the comment. And yeah, Molly made a comment a minute ago saying, read widely and read the old stuff. And it's quite eye-opening. Like if you read Bill Condon's old stuff about interactional synchrony and what he had to go through, looking at films frame by frame and manually annotating what was going on to try and get a sense of interactional synchrony and just see what's happened in 50 years and the tools we're able to use. It's amazing. But I personally, I wouldn't claim technological expertise. I'm in touch with people who, if something like pose estimation is invented, they're likely to show it to me and say, why don't you try using this? So yeah, always open to new things. Yeah.
You sure? Okay. Conch, yeah? Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think you can envisage different types of linkages or use with AI and the research we're doing. One is the sort of thing like using these techniques in computer vision post estimation to make our jobs easier and to detect things that wouldn't be feasible otherwise. But in terms of, you mentioned the large language models and so on, and if you think about the way these systems learn at the moment, I think one interest, and I'm not sure what's going on in this space, because at the moment, of course, if it's mining text, that's one thing. There's a lot of text out there, but there's of course also a lot of data out there, and I'm not sure how much, and I assume there is this going on, but it's probably not something that we have access to at this stage, unsupervised learning of what's going on in music performances, in real music performances. Now, getting access to that on a large scale without having to extract it ourselves would raise some interesting questions, I think, to say the least. So the researchers aren't guiding it. The AI itself is actually discovering things, unsupervised.
Well, I suppose on the Chat GPT analogy, the system that could look at lots of natural musical performances and produce something that sounded like a natural performance, that's a different question from kind of help me to understand what's going on, I guess.
Just a short comment about AI and pose estimation. I think that might facilitate cross-cultural research on movement, so because it makes everything more portable. You don't have to carry a motion capture lab with you when you go to the other side of the world.
Yeah, I'm totally into embracing new technologies to help us learn as much as we possibly can, make our jobs easier, as you said. There are some examples of, I mean, in terms of reading the old stuff, there are all these old papers where there's a whole sort of diagram just to prove that you were able to show a stimulus, or, you know, just to play a sound. You know, there's a whole figure one as the apparatus, and I think maybe I've got the history wrong, but I was told that one of the first, or one of the very first sensory motor synchronization papers was that a piece of paper sort of moved at a constant speed, and the person poked their finger through it, and the distances were measured. So, I mean, we're winning technologically, that we have the ability to, you know, easily deliver, you know, more and more interesting and more, you know, even in the lab, more realistic kinds of experiments. And we have tools to analyze higher and higher dimensional data. So I think, you know, I totally embrace that. We're able to learn more stuff. We're able to learn more deeply all the time because we have access to new tools. But in terms of the, I guess, the sort of, I see a unique contribution of the human as being a generator of novel ideas and a creative generator of experiments and experimental designs. And I know only sort of moderately much about how large language models work, but I don't suspect that creativity that we're able to put into the scientific process is going to be something that's replaceable, even though the tools we have are making our lives analytically easier.
Carolyn, go ahead.
Well, these comments are making me think of the fact that the old AI used to be exhaustive in evaluating all paths equally, and the new is more heuristic. It's trying to use shortcuts, but they're not necessarily the perceptual, attentional, memory constraint shortcuts that we study. So we're trying to capture how humans use music, and I think the AI approach is not. So although their models get more and more heuristic, they're not necessarily the heuristics we care about or we use every day. So I think we will meet at some point, but not necessarily be the same theories because they have different goals.
And I think we've been talking about studying coordination in groups and social entrainment, social interactions, and I mean, maybe it's getting better, but I've seen on the internet, you can sort of put two AIs together and try to make them interact, and they sort of destroy themselves. They destroy each other as they interact more and more. So I think it's not capturing what we're doing when we're making music together, for example.
If I can add just one thing, I don't want to say that virtual partners are not the way to go. I was referring more to the machine learning approach to coming up with an essay on a particular topic. That approach doesn't care how humans do it. Its goal is to get to as best an essay as possible, not necessarily the way humans do it. But the virtual partner approach is truly trying to take into account how humans do it, because the virtual partner has to interact with those humans in real time. So I just wanted to distinguish my comments.
Thank you for wonderful question, Bavo. That was very stimulating. I'll just grab one from the YouTube chat, because Connor's speech is asked, how would dynamic systems or entrainment theory, which is usually held to be quite bottom-up, explain how the same rhythm can be heard in different meters? Is a predictive process necessary? Yes, Carolyn.
No.
And they're both in the same city, so I'm sure Connor heard you through the walls.
Oh, again, this comes down to what are we theorizing about? If we're trying to predict the actual processes based on the evidence, then, we do careful experiments to tweak the stimulus information and measure the system's response. So there are ways dynamical systems individuals have modeled shifts by stabilities based on the same rhythm. And the bistable states are the two metrical interpretations of the same rhythm. It's very hard to come up with rhythms that are perfectly bistable, that is, equally support or can equally be perceived from each meter. And there are good reasons why it's hard to come up with them. But the bifurcation in the differential equations that signals the shift from one stable point to another is predictive itself. I know that Connor probably didn't mean predictive the same way I just used it, but that's why the simple answer is no.
He might have. You have to talk to him, but maybe you guys can meet for coffee or lunch today in Montreal. I saw one last question from the audience here.
Oh, thank you. I hope this question isn't dead on arrival, but I'll try it anyway. Can you speak to music's unique role in explaining entrainment? So do you think music, do you think music is the culmination of all of human evolution in our ability to mirror and entrain? And if it's not, and we are interested in entrainment, then why are we studying it through music?
Oof.
Maybe that.
Big question. That's more than this next 2 minutes has, I think, but who would like to give this a stab?
I don't know. Maybe the answer's dead on arrival. I think it'd be quite a bold thing to say it's the ultimate, the end point or whatever. I certainly wouldn't use language like that, but I think you're talking about something that humans across the world all do, and it's fundamentally requires entrainment in order to do it, and it uses entrainment in quite different ways with quite different results, and it produces forms of alignment between behavior and perhaps between brain activity and so on that some or possibly many of which might only be developed in music. So I think there are good reasons for studying entrainment through music.
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe not much to add, or there'll be a lot to add, because it's a long discussion, of course, and you of course, are aware of that. I suppose this is where things like this is an evolutionary question, and this is where the comparative approach becomes useful, and of course, there's more and more work on this. So I think as meetings, these sorts of workshops go on, it would be good to have more cross-fertilization between the people studying human musicking and music-like behavior in other species to maybe get at that issue.
And if I can actually eat into our break a bit, this kind of ties right into the next question that I had planned, but also that Andrzej Smiekowski has actually just asked, which is, as our research continues to evolve toward greater interdisciplinarity, what primary challenges do you foresee arising along this trajectory, and what strategies do you consider most effective for mitigating these challenges? Because this workshop has been extremely interdisciplinary, and people have maybe been able to follow different presentations to various degrees. So how can we, what is the best way to move forward with the interdisciplinary approach?
What's the best way? I don't know. I'm going to keep the microphone for a second because I've done a lot of this stuff. The best way, I don't know, but I'd say from my experience, I've collaborated a lot with people from other disciplines, one of whom sitting to my right here. So, people like Peter or Thomas Erola, people like that in Durham, computer scientists, psychologists, various people. I think effectively, and for me, the process is about developing relationships I mean, I think relationships between disciplines don't happen, relationships between individuals happen. So it's about sitting down with someone and saying, look, this is the kind of stuff I'm interested in. I think I found something interesting. Maybe I've got a question I don't have the answer to, but I think a psychologist might. Does that question make sense to you? Do you have a method for that? It might mean sometimes just trying to think like someone from the other discipline. You know, I'm not a psychologist, but I spend a lot of time working with psychologists. So I've got this kind of second-hand sense of how psychologists think. So I might say, or you know, I've had this a lot recently with computer scientists. You know, the computer scientists will say, you know, yeah, I can do that, but it's really not interesting. Give me an interesting computer science question. So I have to think, well, like, what are computer scientists working on? What kind of thing might be an interesting computer? Okay, I've got this thing. Maybe this is an interesting computer science question. And it's like that kind of personal relationship over a long time, and B, trying to think yourself into the other person's mind, trying to understand how someone from the other discipline might think. And that kind of communication, that's what's been, I think, has been effective for me, and also the good luck of working with people like Peter.
Would anyone else like to comment? It's the last word on the topic. All right, well, thank you so much for the wonderful questions, wonderful answers, wonderful discussion. That concludes the panel, and we now have 13 minutes of a break, and we'll be back for the last session of presentations. So thank you so much. Give it a round of applause.